Okay, so I want to first get into your background as an expert in biological warfare. So you were the first to prove that an epidemic in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, was due to biological warfare. Can you tell us about this? Anthrax? What's the story on this?
Well, Rhodesia was a colony of the UK, and but it had a very small minority white population of maybe 5%, and the rest were blacks. And it was an apartheid country, and the country was basically divided in half so that the less valuable properties were given over to black people to live in and farm in, and the other half was for white people and their properties, their farms, etc. There, the During the 1960s, all the countries essentially that in Africa that were colonies got freedom
Mhm.
from Germany, from Portugal, from England, from Belgium, etc. And yet, the whites declared independence of England, so England would not give its independence to the blacks, to the black majority.
Mhm.
And so a 15-year kind of war of skirmishes began. And the first 10 years, not a lot happened, but in the later years of the 15, there was a lot of dirty war things going on, with the whites using chemical and biological warfare agents against blacks. And eventually they came to a negotiated truce, and the black majority did get independence in 1980 or 81. But starting in 1978, there was an anthrax epidemic, which actually moved from place to place and stayed. And because of the nature of the country, because it had been divided in half, and certain half the areas were tribal trust lands where only black people lived, the anthrax was spread only in those areas. And in my view, it was done as a form of low intensity warfare and food control to reduce the wealth of the blacks, so they couldn't fight and so they couldn't share food with with those who were the soldiers. Um, so anyway, this happened. Now, how do you spread anthrax? It doesn't spread person to person, so it had to have been spread probably by plane or by helicopter. It was eaten by cattle primarily. Cattle was the main source of wealth. And humans who butchered the cows or ate them, and if the meat wasn't cooked well enough, would come down with anthrax. And so there were actually over 10,000 cases of anthrax in humans in Rhodesia, which then later was named Zimbabwe after it got independence at that time. And so this had never happened before. It was the largest outbreak in humans ever recorded. And I had been studying anthrax and realized when I took a look at this epidemic and compared it with all the others that it was very, very different, and that it was an act of biological warfare, probably. And then I spent several years and had a trip to Zimbabwe to actually do the research and find out if that was true and confirm it. And then I wrote a paper about it and spoke at conferences about this.
So I mean, I'm ignorant on it. I apparently am ignorant on what anthrax is. I was always under the impression that anthrax was like a chemical or something that was made in a lab, and then people would get mailers of anthrax if they were being, for assassination attempts. So let's start with what is anthrax exactly?
Yeah. So it's anthrax is an unusual bacterium,
Ah,
right? Multiple.
okay.
So single is bacterium, multiple is bacteria. And unlike most other bacteria, it actually grows its own spore. Tetanus bacteria do that also. And so because it grows a spore, it sort of makes this hard covering around the actual bacteria, and that it goes into a state of essentially suspended animation, and it can be alive but not growing for 100 years.
Hmm.
and it can stay in soil. And then when certain conditions arise and you get the right nutrients, the right temperature, and right moisture, etc., and it outcompetes other soil organisms, it can grow in the soil. And then animals that graze or browse in that area pick it up and they get anthrax. And then humans get it from the animals. Because it forms a spore, you can just send it in an envelope as a powder. And while it's in this state of suspended animation, it's essentially dead. But once you inhale it and it gets into your lungs where it's warm and moist and there are things for it to eat, it wakes up, comes
Hmm.
out of the spore, starts growing into its what's called the vegetative state of the bacteria.
Where was it first discovered? Like, where is this indigenous?
Well, it's actually indigenous all over the world.
Huh.
It We used to have epidemics of anthrax in the United States in workers who worked in certain industries. So if you worked in the leather tanning industry, it might be in the skins of the animals who had it, who died. If you worked in the goat hair processing mills, there were about 5 mills in New England and Pennsylvania where people got anthrax from processing goat hair as linings of men's suits. Um, it was called rag pickers disease in some countries. So when there was poor ventilation and people were using these products that were contaminated with anthrax spores, they might inhale them, or if more likely, they would have a cut or something on their hand and get the disease. If you got it on a cut, if you got it on your skin, you could take penicillin, it would go away. It wouldn't be too bad. But if you inhale it and you didn't get treated very quickly, it was usually fatal.
Why do we not see people getting, I mean, we're still using leather goods, we're still eating a lot of meats and animal products. So why aren't we seeing outbreaks of anthrax now naturally? Or are we?
So in the United States, we have one case in a human a decade, and that's usually from uh, using an African drum or using some imported product. Now, the leather, the goat hair, all of that is processed with formaldehyde or other chemicals that kill all the spores. So it's no longer a problem for us here in developed countries. But animals still get it because it's still in the soil. So there is a cattle trail
Mm.
from, say, Texas all the way up to the Dakotas in Canada, where cattle have walked for hundreds of years, and at times they have died of anthrax. They have their remains stay there, and every once in a while, every 10 or 20 years, if the conditions are right, anthrax grows in that soil again, and some of the cattle will catch it. And then they will vaccinate those cows just in that one area to protect the rest of the herd.
What happens when you get anthrax? So then, okay, so then if a person were to, so an animal gets it by eating from grazing, and then how would a person get it from the cattle? Because you were saying from the skins. So not
Yes,
even eating the cattle, you just are touching the cattle and you can end up with anthrax.
yes, that's correct. So if the spores get into a cut, you can get it if you're butchering the animal. If you eat the animal, you can get gastrointestinal anthrax. It's quite rare. And that also has a high mortality rate, probably at least 50%. And in the people who inhaled anthrax that we know of, um, when the anthrax letters were sent in 2001, 5 of 11 who developed inhalation anthrax died despite treatment because they weren't treated quickly enough.
So can you get inhaled anthrax from cattle?
Not really, not
Okay, that's
outdoors,
what right.
because you need a lot of spore. If you're getting inhalation anthrax, you need like thousands of spores, maybe millions. Your body can fight them off if there's just a few.
So how would you, if you're just out in the wild as a person, how would you inhale? What would be the condition that would cause it to suddenly go up in the air and you'd breathe it?
Well, if it was made for biological warfare, you can put a
Well, let's say it
charge on
wasn't,
it. If it
because what I'm
wasn't,
trying to get at is how they then got it to biological warfare. So I'm just trying to think of like in nature at first. Is it possible to inhale anthrax naturally, just completely natural?
basically no.
Okay. So this
Not
is so the
outdoors.
okay.
Only indoors. If there's poor ventilation and there's something contaminated with anthrax spores, and you fluff it up, yes, you could get it into the air and breathe it in. But outdoors, you're never going to breathe enough.
So then at what point did whoever was making biological weapons, or who was the person that said, "Oh, hey, we could take this anthrax that is infecting some cattle here and there, and once in a while in a poor ventilated factory, and we could turn this into a powder substance that we could then use as obviously a weapon." There's no, I mean, does it have any medicinal purpose at all?
No, no
Okay, so
medicinal purpose.
so you would be using this solely to attack. That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Who decided, when did that development
Sorry.
happen?
So the United States was making anthrax during World War II as a potential weapon against the Germans. And we
Huh.
were making it in cattle cakes, and we were going to use it with the Brits in a factory outside of Terre Haute, Indiana. Now, other countries and we, the US, have made it as powder, in a liquid in different ways to be used as a biological weapon. But after the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, we were supposed to have destroyed all our supplies and not used it anymore. What we found was that a small amount was held for the CIA of anthrax and some other weapons because they just didn't want it all destroyed. They needed it for their assassinations or other things.
Right.
But we weren't the only ones because the Russians also didn't follow the treaty, and they had a leak in 1979 of anthrax spores from an anthrax factory, and that killed about 60 people in the town of Sverdlovsk, which is now called Yekaterinburg.
What happens when you inhale anthrax?
It goes into your lungs and germinates, and you are usually get a pleural effusion, a bloody pleural effusion. You get infection within the lung and on the outside of the lung, and then it can go into your bloodstream and travel anywhere. It can get into the meninges, which lines your spinal cord and brain. So very nasty infection. If you get into the late stage, there's not much that can be done for you. But if you have any idea that it was anthrax, there's lots of antibiotics that will work. We also have monoclonal antibodies. We have other treatments as long as you don't get into this late stage.
What are the symptoms then? How would I know?
In the beginning, it's going to seem just like a cold or flu the first day or two. So you have to have known that there was, an envelope with white powder or something like that in order to suspect it. If doctors says now, if the first case from the anthrax letters was diagnosed fairly early because a spinal tap was done, and a doctor actually looked at it under the microscope and could see the anthrax growing.
What made them
It
want
has
it? What
it has
was
an
there like?
unusual. It has. I think it's a gram positive. Uh, anyway, it stains. I can't
Uh,
remember the exact coloration of it, but it stains differently than other bacteria. So if you know what it is, you look at the microscope and say, "Oh wow, that's going to be a
mhm.
bacillus."
But what made that doctor do that? Was there must have been a suspicion?
No, he just did a gram stain. He just did an
Just
he did an what he did that might have been different was he actually didn't put it in a machine. He looked at it himself with his own eyes. A lot of things are automated now, and people don't look at all the slides.
yeah.
And that I think that's a problem. If you get a pap smear, the chances are no human is going to look at it.
Hmm. So the symptoms, so you would inhale this, it's colorless, it's odorless. Would you know in any way that it was anthrax besides, "Oh, I saw a white
No,
powder"?
no, you wouldn't.
Okay. So you just inhale this, and then it starts off, you think you have a cold, like how quickly does this develop? And then at what point, how long before it gets to that point where there's like no return?
So there's two factors that are important. One is how good is your immune system, and the other one is how many spores did you inhale and how virulent were they.
Mm,
So I can't answer that question. Some people get an overwhelming illness. If somebody who worked in a lab with anthrax and their air handling equipment failed, that person got a lot of it in, and in a day they were, practically moribund.
Oh, wow.
But for a normal person, you'd probably have about 4 or 5 days.
Okay. So then, when this was used as a biological weapon in Zimbabwe, what is now Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia at the time, how long did it take before these people were obviously sick and infected and dying?
So most of them, the vast majority, had cutaneous or skin anthrax. And so they just developed an ulcer. It usually turns dark in color. So the ulcer looks different than other ulcerations. And they would go to the doctor. You could give them penicillin or, any antibiotic except cephalosporin. And it would usually cure it. And probably no one would look under a microscope to see what was growing there. Um, and those were all people who were exposed to meat from the infected cattle.
Hmm.
So it wasn't inhalation anthrax for them. Some of them got gastrointestinal anthrax. So with over 10,000 cases, there were only a documented 200 or so deaths.
Okay, because these people were treated early.
Yeah.
So, who then spread the anthrax and where did they get it?
So that we don't know,
Huh.
but we know that so the white Rhodesians were working with South Africa. South Africa had a biological warfare facility. They were developing biological weapons. They were not a party to the treaty. We know that the head of chemical and biological warfare in South Africa, a fellow named Dr. Bassong, had also traveled to the US and the UK. So it's possible he picked it up there. It's naturally occurring in almost all countries. So you could, if you know where to look on that cattle trail, you could get it right out of the soil. Now, what we do know is that the strain of anthrax that was found in Zimbabwe was a highly virulent strain. So it probably came from a biological warfare lab and had been selected for virulence.
But you never found out who did it.
No, no.
How did you prove it was that it was biological warfare? Because I would imagine, so how long did the anthrax epidemic last?
Well, it's almost not over yet. So because once it's in
Ah,
the soil, it's in the soil. So every year or two, they have people dying of anthrax and cattle because it's been spread to many more places. So I actually collect because Rhodesia had been a British colony. They were actually keeping records of anthrax cases before any of this happened for like
hmm.
30 years or more before. And so I was able to go find those records in a government library in Zimbabwe and show how many people were reported with anthrax every year. And then all of a sudden, you've got years where thousands of people are getting reported. And now sometimes some years they might have 100 people being reported.
But the years where it was really suspicious, how
Yeah.
many years was this, and how many
This
people
it
were?
was three years where the
Okay,
78, 79, 80, and 81 actually were the worst. And in 81, they finished the war, they made the treaty, all of that happened. And then it was, so nobody was spreading it any longer, but they were still stuck with what was in the soil.
sure. So what were they saying? So before you were like, hey, this is kind of suspicious and maybe we should kind of look into this. And it's, I see it's biological warfare. What were they saying? Or the media, doctors, health agencies, what were they saying was happening there?
Um, so there were a variety of different theories propounded for how this could have happened. And, it helps if you take a disease like anthrax, where basically nobody knows anything about it because there's so
Right.
little of it in the world now. So it was said that it was spread by flies. It was said that it was spread by people carrying meat from one area to another. Um, it was said that the terrorists, which meant the black indigenous people, were using it as a weapon. Of course, that's pretty unlikely. They didn't have access to that kind of weapon. And I basically was able to show that it's never been transmitted by a fly. You can make a fly transmit it in a laboratory under perfect conditions, but there are no reports of fly transmission in the literature. It doesn't get transmitted by flies. So, that was easy. And I was able to show that there was no, it didn't cross borders. So Zimbabwe borders about 5 countries, and none of them had anthrax outbreaks. And, anyway, it normally adheres to only certain weather conditions, but in Zimbabwe, it didn't do that. And people didn't carry enough meat to justify that explanation. And there was another explanation that the veterinary services weren't in effect during the war, and so they weren't properly you have to bury animals that die of anthrax deeply so that the spores don't come to the surface and bite you in future. And so it was said that was one of the reasons, but I was able to show why that explanation didn't hold water either. So basically there was no other explanation.
So when you were proving that it was biological warfare, did you prove it by discrediting everything else, or were you able to prove for sure it was biological warfare because you found like the powder in the, the
No,
actual like mate? How did you prove it?
yeah, it was by destroying I think there were 5 or 6 other explanations, and by carefully going through them one by one and showing how none of them um, could explain it. And also by explaining to the public the characteristics of anthrax. So I had to learn in great depth, what these spores do under different circumstances, et cetera.
Yeah.
What I had to study all the other epidemics and show that this just didn't follow any of the characteristics of a normal outbreak.
So this was kind of one of the, maybe the first or one of the first of the lab leak theory type scenarios, right? So this
Yes.
was people saying, oh, this, it was a bat, but in this case, it was a fly, right?
Yes,
It was a fly.
exactly.
And you were saying, no, this came from a lab. How were you treated then?
Um, how was I treated?
And by the way, were
When
you
did this
doing this in
happen?
real time? Like when
Yeah.
you proved it was biological warfare, was that at the time this was actually happening, or was it years later?
So as I say, the war ended in 81, and I got wind of this in 88 or 89, and
Okay.
I started working on it very hard, and it took me 3 years. And so not until 1992 did I have enough evidence that it was an airtight case.
Okay.
And so I published it then, and I knew people at Fort Detrick. I presented it to them. I sent it off to a lot of infectious disease experts as well as biological warfare experts for review. And so I had all my ducks in a row, and people thought it was interesting. It wasn't the kind of thing you could talk about back then. It's kind of funny. That's not entirely true. But as I was doing the research, the Gulf War happened.
Hmm.
And so people started to become aware that, yes, this actually can be used as a weapon. And nobody ever disputed the facts with me. So for 20 years. And then in the last few years, a couple of people with CIA connections have published papers sort of saying, no, it was natural. And so I'm not sure why it took 20 years for that to
So you're
happen,
saying
but
just now people are starting to say, oh, no, they're trying to discredit you now.
yeah, but
Mm.
quietly. I mean, I don't think they wanted me to know they had published, in one case, a book it was mostly about chemical warfare, but had a little bit about biological. And that was Glenn Cross. And then there was another guy, the University of Nevada. I forget his name. But he published an article also about how it was natural. And as I said, both of them have had CIA connections. So I think the CIA, I think my take on all that is that the CIA wants to be able to use biological weapons in future and wants to dispute that anyone can actually tell the difference between a naturally occurring outbreak and a biological warfare event. And so that if they can, because I'm really the only one who's taken an epidemic and shown it was due to biological warfare, so that if they can discredit that, they'll have better luck with the natural theories in future.
like the one that we just maybe, went
Yeah.
through. Hey guys, be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you like this segment. Now, you might be wondering, this seems like it's part of a bigger show. You're right, it is. The full show is at KimIversonShow.com. So what you're watching is just a clip. And if you want to get the full experience, then you got to go to KimIversonShow.com. The show airs Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. That is where you can watch the full show. Here, you just get clips. So click on the link down below, go to the full show, enjoy. Otherwise, I'll see you next time right here. And be sure, once again, like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.